landmarks, discovery tour of Assassin's Creed Origins, and celebration of Assassin's Creed 15. Hosted by Historian's Perspective, that's me, and we're going to get started with 3 tours today, possibly 4 if we have time, starting out at the Siege of Alexandria. So let's go ahead and start this tour.
Welcome to the Siege of
Alexandria was in particular Rome against Egypt, primarily from the text of Julius Caesar.
To Julius Caesar are his descriptions of the Siege of Alexandria, the Gallic Wars, and the commentaries on the Civil War. These archives contain information on different campaigns, the wars of Alexandria, Africa, and Spain. Each of them recounts Caesar's military activity from 58 BCE to 45 BCE. Though Caesar's documents remain a main source of information, it's important to note that the perspective is limited. It is necessary for other historical documents to be taken into consideration to provide a better understanding of events.
Julius Caesar had multiple works throughout his writing. Some of them actually are believed to have been ghostwriters, especially in his later passages of his De Bello Gallico. I believe it's later than Book 9. But Caesar goes into great depth, making the language simpler for the average Latin reader, yet it provides a lot of great information, especially with his opening line of the De Bello Gallico immediately describes the people and the place of what he is moving into. The opening line starts, Gaul as a whole is divided into 3 parts, and then it begins to describe the exact boundaries of Gaul by their mountain ranges, their rivers, and the people who inhabit each area. As an example of what Caesar's writing would look like.
The Siege of Alexandria closely relays the events of the Civil War that led up to the event and describes how Caesar was besieged in the palace of the Ptolemies. Other ancient authors have left equally valuable and sometimes contradictory information. In the events leading up to the Siege of Alexandria, Cleopatra VII and her brother were fighting over control of Egypt. Young King Ptolemy XIII's regent, Pothinus, had firm control over the young pharaoh, and an outmaneuvered Cleopatra soon went into hiding. This set the stage for Pompey's arrival in Alexandria. Having lost his battle against Caesar in 48 BCE, the Roman general turned to his allies, the Egyptians, for safe harbor. But on the advice of Pothinus, Ptolemy XIII had Pompey assassinated in the hopes of earning Caesar's favor. This would turn out to be a most unfortunate decision.
This exact scene has been portrayed in Roman television shows such as Rome, and it has been described that Caesar, upon learning of Ptolemy's death, was driven into great rage over the way Ptolemy was treated, because Ptolemy was still a very high-ranking nobleman in Roman politics, and both Ptolemy and Caesar greatly respected each other, both of them having military careers going back decades with a long-standing relationships, including with the First Triumvirate.
Upon his arrival in Alexandria, Caesar was presented with Pompey's head. The sight of a Roman murdered by Egyptians did not sit well with him. Caesar made his displeasure clear, ordering the return of Cleopatra, and for the siblings to resolve their differences and resume their co-rule of Egypt, as per the will of their father. Neither Pothinus nor Ptolemy XIII wished to accede to this demand. While doing his best to aggravate Caesar, Pothinus secretly plotted against the Roman ruler and sent word for Egyptian general Achillas to bring his 20,000 men to fight on his behalf. While Pothinus plotted against Caesar, Cleopatra made a bold move.
As someone who has studied a great amount of Roman history, the one thing you do not do is make Julius Caesar, of all people, desperate. it does not turn out very well for you. Just ask the Gauls back at the Siege of Alexandria. Well, I could hijack one of these camels like it's a GTA. Probably be there by now. While we do traveling during today's tours, make sure to stay active in the chats and follow AC Landmarks on Instagram and Twitter, as well as myself, Historian's Perspective, at Instagram and Twitter, where we will be showing future historical threads as well as research across ancient Egypt. We are currently working on a domestication of animals research, as well as make sure to go back and look at the thread by AC Landmarks on the Library of Alexandria, which we'll be covering later in today's broadcast.
There are various descriptions of the encounter between Caesar and Cleopatra. One report states that she snuck into the palace alone at night. Another account claims she was accompanied by an ally and was brought inside the palace wrapped in a carpet bag. Though exactly what happened at this fateful meeting is up for debate, what is known is that Cleopatra met with Caesar and earned his approval. Pothinus and Ptolemy XIII were most vexed with this turn of events.
That's a little dangerous seeing them really close together. Just reminds me of during the game where Cleopatra says, I will sleep with any man tonight, willing to be executed in the morning. Just think history would say that's one amazing way to go, wouldn't it?
With Cleopatra finally present, Caesar chose to act as mediator between the siblings in the hopes of a peaceful resolution. It did not take long for things to sour. During a banquet given to celebrate the reconciliation, there was an assassination attempt on Caesar. It was the Roman leader's own barber who thwarted the attack. Once it was revealed that the king's regent, Pothinus, had ordered the attack, Caesar had him executed. He then placed the young king under guard.
There are many women across antiquity who've been described with a strong sense of beauty. There's been Helen, Cleopatra. There have even been some modern remakes based off of her statues and other art to show what she possibly looked like in a modern sense.
Caught within the palace with roughly 4,000 troops, and with the knowledge that the arrival of enemy forces was imminent, Caesar sent for help from Syria, Rhodes, and Cilicia. He ordered his men to dig a ditch around the palace and build a wall leading to the harbor. This would ensure Caesar's access to the sea. When Egyptian General Achillas arrived in the city with 20,000 men, the battle for Alexandria began.
Having access to the sea is incredibly important in antiquity. It allows you an area to retreat as well as bring in reinforcements. It also gives you access to additional food. As long as there is not a blockade taking place, it allows you to withstand a siege almost inevitably.
With so few men at his disposal, Caesar could not risk a battle just yet. He sent ambassadors to Achillas in the name of Ptolemy to propose a truce. Knowing that the orders did not come from the young king, and angered by the pharaoh's imprisonment, Achillas had the messengers assassinated. With Caesar confined within the palace, Achillas positioned his troops around the city. Skirmishes broke out throughout the streets of Alexandria and went on for several days and nights. Though they were outnumbered, Caesar's men were able to hold the enemy back. This prompted Achillas' next move: capture the Roman fleet stationed in the harbor.
Caesar had a knack for being successful when he was outnumbered. This is another example of it. I wonder what Caesar's headspace would have been like at the time. Would he have been nervous? Would he have been stressed? Or would this have allowed him to fully express his tactical genius?
Although the palace offered protection, losing the port meant the end of help and supplies. Caesar knew he had to protect the fleet. While he and his troops succeeded in regaining control of the port, he knew it would be impossible to sustain. Caesar ordered the burning of the ships. With passage back to the palace closed off, he headed for the lighthouse of Alexandria.
It's all in the wrist.
Fighting their way through the Egyptian troops, Caesar and his men eventually reached Pharis Island. There, they took refuge within the lighthouse. With easy access to the open sea, Caesar was able to send messages to his allies requesting reinforcements and more supplies. The island fort also allowed him to control access to the harbor by relying on the chains used by the Egyptians to control ship traffic to and from Alexandria's docks. The exact chronology of events during the war in Alexandria remain imprecise. Conflicting accounts raise questions as to when, and even if, the Great Library of Alexandria was burned down at all. One account states that during the fighting, docks and warehouses were burned, and this was the fire that spread to the library. In another account, when Achillas cut off the harbor, Caesar had to leave the safety of the palace to defend his ships. As the enemies battled across the port, their arsenals set ships ablaze, and this destruction spread to the library.
Oh sure, we're going to call the burning of the Alexandrian Library an accident.
In either case, the Great Library was not completely destroyed. Experts point out that its location was too far from the harbor, and much later texts refer to the Great Library as being intact. Warehouses near the harbor contained manuscript copies awaiting export, and it is more likely that these documents were destroyed than the Great Library itself. The destruction of the Great Library may have been due to a number of fires over the ages. Its end was probably closer to the 4th century CE, when the Christian Emperor Theodosius I ordered the closure of all pagan temples. While some documents survived after being moved away, it remains unclear just what knowledge may have been lost.
Obviously, the secret to life, immortal life, was hidden in that library.
Where there are accounts of Achillas being in control of the battle against Caesar, it appears that instead Cleopatra's sister, siding with her brother, had him killed and put her ally Ganymedes in his place. Ganymedes proved a valuable tactician for the Egyptian side. It was his idea to cut Caesar's access to the harbor, thus trapping Caesar at the palace. During the time of Ptolemy I, canals had been dug throughout Alexandria to provide fresh water. Ganymedes had his men take control of these canals. After isolating their own water supply, he had his men pour salt water into the canals and cisterns that led to Caesar's camp.
Quite smart. Controlling fresh water is a very good way to cripple your enemy.
Panic erupted in Caesar's men. They wouldn't last long without fresh water. Recognizing that the porous limestone could help them, Caesar and his men dug wells to restore their water supply. Days later, the 37th Legion, comprised of Pompey's soldiers, arrived by ship. Unable to come ashore due to the winds, Caesar risked going out to meet them on the peninsula, Cape Chersonese. When the enemy learned Caesar's location, they rushed to intercept. Despite an obvious advantage for the Alexandrians, Caesar, with a Rhodian ship full of skillful sailors, emerged victorious. With help from the Allied ships, Caesar's victory enabled him to push the Egyptians back and secure the lighthouse. Gaining control of Pharos Island sent the Alexandrians into the sea and swimming back to the city. However, Caesar's fortification of the island didn't last long. The enemy regrouped and were set to storm the island. Panic-stricken, in spite of Caesar's encouragement, many of his men then fled their posts, either by ship or jumping into the sea. Caesar attempted to retreat, but Port Eunostos' harbor was overrun with enemy ships, preventing escape. Reportedly, Caesar gathered his papers and leapt overboard in an attempt to swim to an Allied ship farther out. Historian Cassius Dio claimed that Caesar would have drowned if he hadn't been able to remove his purple garment. Still, he managed to swim the distance and survive. The Alexandrians recovered the cloak and used it as a trophy to commemorate the Roman debacle.
I read that and it just makes me think about Pirates of the Caribbean when Jack Sparrow said, "We must fight to run away, but live to fight another day."
Unhappy with Ganymedes and wanting their king restored, the Alexandrians approached Caesar with a compromise. Caesar agreed to release Ptolemy XIII after entreating him to spare the kingdom and remain loyal to Rome. Once freed, however, the king defied the agreement and continued the war. By this time, a faithful ally of Caesar's, Mithridates, arrived in Egypt, clashing with Ptolemy's troops at Pelusium. Outnumbering the enemy, Mithridates secured the region between Pelusium and Alexandria. Ptolemy, warned of Caesar's ally marching on Alexandria, sent his troops to prevent passage over the river. Mithridates warned Caesar in time, and the two groups confronted the armies of Ptolemy in the Delta. In the Battle of the Nile, the Romans gained the upper hand, sending the Egyptians fleeing. In the tumult and panic, King Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile.
Well, King Ptolemy is said to have drowned. There's also, I believe, very little evidence that his body was ever recovered, so it's possible he could have been eaten by the wildlife.
After the siege ended, Cleopatra VII
I'll have to double
married
check
her
my sources
younger
on
brother,
that.
Ptolemy XIV, enabling her to reign over Egypt until 30 BCE. Under her rule, Alexandria settled into its position within the Roman Empire, and eventually surpassed Athens as one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire.
That's
Julius
one bit of
Caesar
wrong
remained
information,
in
though.
Egypt for a short
Rome was
time.
not an
He and
empire
Cleopatra would
until
later
it
have
was
a son
formally
named Caesarion.
changed. Or at least it was not seen as an empire until the reign of Augustus, which wouldn't have started until 27. So at this time, it was still the Roman Republic, even though it was led by the triumvirates. Domestication of animals in ancient Egypt. We are currently working on research for this as a historical overlay, possible thread, but make sure to keep an eye out for that on the Instagram and Twitter regardless.
Welcome to Domesticated Animals of Ancient Egypt. Agriculture and domesticated livestock were introduced 6,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found traces of cattle, donkeys, pigs, and dogs. Dromedary are thought to have been introduced during the Persian invasion. Pets were deeply cherished in ancient Egypt. Many illustrations of children often include a pet in the depiction. One of ancient Egypt's most iconic animals, the cat, wasn't adopted into their daily life until the Middle Kingdom. Since they were so highly capable of killing snakes and rodents, cats were present throughout every period. However, they only became pets sometime during the Middle Kingdom. Prince Thutmose, son of Amenhotep III, had his cat Tamu laid to rest in its own sarcophagi.
So cats had a special privilege in Egypt. Cats were always good pest control.
The earliest reference to dogs dates back to 5000 BCE. They were popular pets as they helped hunters and protected herds. They were closely linked to Anubis, the jackal-headed god. Baboons, monkeys, and even falcons were tamed as pets. Each was mummified and buried with as much ceremony as any family member. Welcome to the Great Library of Alexandria. Near the district of royal palaces and within the Moseon was the most famous library of all antiquity. The Library of Alexandria was built to house all of human knowledge. At its pinnacle, the library was believed to contain over 700,000 parchments.
I believe this would be comparative, or a comparison to modern America's use of the Library of Congress.
Throughout the centuries, fires and wars between Christianity and paganism destroyed the library, leaving nothing behind. The loss of the building, and more importantly, its vast collection, is immeasurable. As no descriptions are available, the team's rendition of the Library of Alexandria was inspired by the visuals of the Library of Chalcis at Ephesus. While much of the collection was purchased at the government's expense, the library also obtained books through other means. Any books owned by travelers coming through the city were seized to be copied for the library. The copy would then be returned to the owner, and the original entered into the library's collection.
I always found that fact funny. Keep the original, hand back a receipt.
Alexandria offered unrivaled intellectual and cultural attractions. Eminent scholars from Athens, Rhodes, and other Greek centers traveled to the city to learn and engage with other free thinkers. Both the Moseon and the library were at the center of groundbreaking ideas and creative expression. The great minds of antiquity were usually well versed in many disciplines, which were often associated to specific schools of thought. The Peripatetics, the Stoics, and the Cynics were among the most well-known schools of the time. It is clear that Alexandria lived up to its fundamental role as a city for intellectuals, nurturing many great minds whose impact reverberates through our modern world. Hypatia of Alexandria was a Greek mathematician, philosopher, astronomer, and inventor. Though born in Greece, she eventually migrated to Alexandria, like many great minds of the time. It is there that she became the head of the Neoplatonist school of Alexandria. From most accounts, she was highly respected by her fellow Alexandrians, both as a teacher and a philosopher. With her death, the age of great ancient scientific discoveries came to an end. Callimachus was born in Cyrene and educated in Athens. After his studies, he moved to Alexandria to work in the Great Library. A poet and a critic, he strongly rejected the epic format of Homeric poems, and instead fervently supported a shorter, more judiciously formulated style of poetry. His epigrams and elegiac poems were emulated by later poets. His work was extremely popular, second only to Homer's own works. It was in Alexandria that mathematician Euclid, the father of geometry, wrote the Elements, laying out the foundational work of what would become modern algebra and number theory. Euclidean geometry would become one of the most influential systems in the evolution of mathematics.
For those of you who hated math in high school, here's the guy to blame.
How do you calculate the circumference of the Earth? With a camel, 2 sticks, and shadows cast by the sun. This is what Eratosthenes of Cyrene described in his principal work, Geography, while he was director of the Great Library of Alexandria. He is credited for the invention of the armillary spear around 250 BCE.
quite an interesting map here. Hispania, Gallia, Albion being Britain. I believe the King Arthur tales describe Albion as a land in which King Arthur fought.
The earliest known and most complete armillary sphere of antiquity was the Meteoroscopion of Alexandria, with an imposing 9 rings compared to the 3 or 4 of most other astrolabes. Known as the Zodiac Krikotoi amongst the Greeks, the Meteoroscopion was used to determine the location of celestial bodies around the Earth. Every self-respecting astronomer of antiquity would have sought to use this tool to better understand the celestial movements. Pythagoras of Samos was a well-known and respected philosopher and mathematician. He is best known for the Pythagorean theorem. However, there is proof that the theorem existed in Babylonia and India long before Pythagoras was born, casting some doubts as to who exactly originated the theorem.
I reckon we could do one more quick session before we call it a stream.
Welcome to the Hippodrome of Alexandria. The main hippodrome of the city was called the Lageion, in honor of Lagos, the ancestor of the Ptolemies. Alexandrians were great lovers of horse racing. They were fascinated by the rivalry of these races, the agon, as it was said at that time, that every competition brought. It was a struggle for glory. The most important chariot race was the Tethrippon. Using 4 horses with the quickest harness to the front right, the charioteer would race for 12 laps, with sharp turns at either end of the hippodrome. The victors were crowned with garlands of olive and received prize money, but the most sought-after reward was to be acclaimed by the works of poets, such as Callimachus and Pindar.
The original NASCAR. What would have been their version of just popping open a beer?
Ye hymns that rule the lyre, what god, what hero, aye, and what man shall we loudly praise? Verily Zeus is the lord of Pisa, and Heracles established the Olympic festival, while Tethrippon must be proclaimed by reason of his victorious chariot with its 4 horses. Tethrippon, who is just in his regard for guests, and who is the bulwark of Achillas, the choicest flower of an auspicious line of sires, whose city towers on high, bringing wealth and glory to crown their native merits.
A hippodrome would also be a unique aspect for horse races, but it would also be an earlier design of what would become the Circus Maximus in Rome. Entertainment was very important to those of antiquity. From the Colosseum to the Hippodrome to the Circus Maximus, anything that could provide entertainment and pleasure for the crowds was great and highly popularized by those in the political classes to gain support for office. But as for right now, that'll be the end of this week's stream in Alexandria for Assassin's Creed Origins. Make sure to keep a lookout for next week's stream, which will be in AC Valhalla to celebrate AC-15. And make sure to follow AC_landmarks at both Instagram and Twitter for future posts. And make sure to follow me at Historian's Perspective at both Twitter and Instagram. And we will see you guys in the next live stream.